we might make a start now. Thank you for joining us today for the next of our International Solar Alliance StarSea project webinars. For those unfamiliar with our StarSea project, the StarSea network, the Solar Technology and Application Resource Centre network, is our capacity building project, which we're developing in conjunction with the United Nations Industrial Development Organisation to support the deployment of solar in ISA member countries through targeted training and skills development. We're delighted to have IRENA join us today, as well as their fantastic renewable energy experts, to talk about the open solar contracts. And I know, having already had a sneak preview, that this will be a fantastic opportunity to hear more about this valuable resource. And as we look towards 2030, the open solar contracts and their streamlining of project development and financing are becoming increasingly important. And these contracts are something that for us at the International Solar Alliance, with our 68 member countries across the globe, really support our main aims: to reduce the cost of finance, to increase investments in solar in ISA member countries, and most importantly, to scale up the deployment of solar technologies and applications throughout our member countries. Our aim is to support the deployment of 1,000 gigawatts of solar by 2030. And it's through mechanisms, these innovative and effective mechanisms, such as the open solar contracts, that these aims will be achieved. I will very shortly hand over to IRENA, but just very quickly, 2 housekeeping issues from the International Solar Alliance. The first is that our fantastic experts have very graciously agreed to facilitate a question and answer session at the end of their webinar. And so if you please type your questions in the question and answer box, they'll endeavour to get through as many as possible. Secondly, I'd also like to note that we'll be running this webinar with our fantastic experts in French for those of our Francophone community on Monday, the 28th of September. And we'd be delighted if you could join us or to pass it on to those who may be interested. Without further ado, I will hand over to Ahmed Badra, the Acting Director of Project Facilitation and Support from IRENA, for his introduction.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for wherever you are, all colleagues around the audience. Thank you very much, Fiona, and good morning to all well-respected partners, developers, and audience that attending to this seminar with our great partners from ISA. Good morning, Shana, Jean-Pascal, and my colleagues, Jeff, Rin-Kyung, and all colleagues that joining me today to trying to provide a value added for all your knowledge around scaling up solar development or solar power projects development that will benefit the whole world. Actually, today I'm a newcomer to IRENA. It's only about a few months that I joined, and I've been even learning about the great effort and the very high developmental objective of International Solar Alliance, and together with the IRENA, I believe we are going to reach the sky high for adding more and more for scaling up solar PV installation globally. Not to take long of from your time, given the limited time for the seminar, it's quite obvious that following the Climate Action Summit last September 2019, there was an exclusive partnership had been launched among IRENA, Sustainable Energy for All Initiative, and UNDP, and in cooperation with Green Climate Fund, to establish what's called Climate Investment Platform that basically fits nicely and identically with the same objective that my colleague Fiona mentioned earlier in her introductory remarks, which basically scaling up renewable energy investment, helping countries globally to build more and more solar PV and whatever type of solar technology. And coming from banking side, which is my background, I can assure you that the most important part is basically to have what I call it bankable projects agreements and bankable document that will actually balance the rights and obligation on the hosting government or the buyer and the seller as two parties of the contracts. I'm really myself very honored to introduce my colleagues Jean-Pascal Fampa and Ms. Shana Abrams, who are basically one of the interlocutors for the topic of today, which is open solar contract, which is really appreciated not only by IRENA, but all or the majority of the development in financial institution like World Bank and the other continental development banks to see this is happening, because it's really having a potential impact, and it shows quick wins already for utilizing these type of sets of projects agreements. I wouldn't take long for that, but what I would like to say, I wanted to thank ISA. In IRENA, we are very proud of being partnered with ISA, and we are going to capitalize more and more on these trainings by adding more to this partnership and to work together through the CIP to have them with us, because ISA have a great potential globally in order to scale up solar technologies installation around the globe for the benefit of the global population, specifically post-COVID-19. I wouldn't take long more than this. I wish you a very successful training with Mr. Fampa and Mademoiselle Abrams, and I'm sure you will enjoy getting more and more from their both respective huge knowledge. Thank you very much. I'm over to Fiona.
Thank you, Ahmed. And we very much at the ISA value our partnership with IRENA, and we're looking forward to working with you further to support the deployment of solar. And I should have noted, and my apologies for not doing so, a very grateful thanks to IRENA for their support in putting on this webinar and the following webinar in French. I think it's the start of something really great and fantastic. So thank you very much. I'd now like to hand over to Jean-Pascal Fampa for his introduction today.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all our participants, and thank you very much to the ISA and IRENA for the opportunity of presenting the open solar contracts today with my colleague Hannah Abrams. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm the CEO, as you can see, of an organization called Scale, building on the COP21 Terawatt Initiative legacy. Terawatt Initiative is one of the partners that is at the origin of the open solar contract. Scale is a non-for-profit organization aiming to make sustainable affordable. And we support and advise public and private stakeholders, in particular in the EMEA region, in their sustainable strategies and projects towards share value creation and by enabling and leveraging on scale effects. And we are absolutely convinced that in order to get at scale, in order to deploy the quantity of solar and other infrastructure that the humanity needs, it is absolutely necessary to reduce the cost of the service and commodities provided by those infrastructures, and for instance, solar power in our case. And we are very convinced that the open solar contracts are one of the key tools that are necessary to reach to the goal and to achieve the goals of the IRENA, the 1,000 megawatt gigawatt of solar of the International Solar Alliance, and more generally the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. So I hope you will enjoy and learn a little bit more about the open solar contracts today. It's only 1 hour long presentation. These contracts have taken 4 years to be developed and are very comprehensive and detailed. And Hannah will give you an overview of what it is. Certainly, it will require, if you're interested, to have more and to get to dive deeper in the contract themselves and to have more specific trainings on each of them, and we expect to be able to do that as soon as COVID-19 enables us to come and spend a little bit of time with you all, because this kind of training probably requires to be in presence and to be able to have a very active interaction. Without further ado, I will pass the mic to Hannah. Hannah, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal, and welcome to everyone. My name is Hannah Abrams. I am a Director and General Counsel at Channing Law. It has been an honour to have been appointed as legal expert on the Open Solar Contract initiative during the development phase, and it's equally an honour to be part of the dissemination phase and to be participating in the webinar today. Now, without further ado, let's dive right into the training, and we will go to the slide Sounds Familiar. The figures in the slide reflect a narrative that is often heard. The problem in the grid-connected solar industry can be described as a very complicated contractual framework, inherited from conventional power generation that remains mostly the same regardless of project size. This, as I'm sure many of you are aware, has resulted in high legal transaction costs, prolonged timelines, and smaller projects suffering more. Further, risks may be assigned to the parties that are not best positioned to manage them. This can result in binary investment decisions and a higher cost of capital. This point that I've just made, you'll note it's going to be a recurring theme throughout this webinar, the importance of the correct risks being allocated to the correct parties in the correct contracts, which would have the implication of reducing overall project costs. Contractual documentation may prove not to be bankable, which can lead to a failure to achieve financial close. Lastly, best practices and effective solutions may not be disseminated widely, which may result in legal documentation solutions remaining one-off by nature. Everything counts. Indeed, it does. As is evident from the graphs showing a comparison between renewable projects in Abu Dhabi and India, a number of factors together have resulted in the decline in tariffs. Such factors include the contributions of declining equipment costs and the introductions of competitive auctions, which have all been noted as being significant. However, besides equipment costs, tariffs are a composite of a number of constituents, including financing costs, O&M expenses, and the impact of government policies and incentives. A particularly interesting feature on the graphs, and which I personally find fascinating, is that if one factors in the same financing cost assumptions for the two projects, the tariff declines by 36%, illustrating the extent to which financing costs impact the tariff. And you'll note later on in the webinar where we stress the importance of ensuring that lenders are protected to ensure that competitive financing is available. The open solar contracts addresses these drivers by having a properly allocated risk allocation across the suite of documentation, thereby maximising the impact of policy efforts geared towards reducing the overall costs of solar projects. Why is it so difficult? Well, that's a very good question, which I'm sure many of you are aware. Solar projects are the result of a complex series of interactions between several participants trying to manage their objectives, hence their risks. And legitimately, each will develop its own risk matrix in its own perspective. Risk is a subjective concept as it relates to someone's objectives. In a multi-stakeholder context, each has its specific objectives. For example, a government, the objective will include the implementation of public policy, whilst for an equity investor, the objective can include the maximisation of returns. In order for all parties to effectively understand each other's and their own risks, clear expressions of the objectives is essential. At a macro level, in emerging markets, a lack of historical background and data opens up to a misperception of the potential events, their consequences and likelihood. Generally, in the sense, an overestimation of risk. Fundamental work is required to acquire data and develop science in order to avoid as much as possible misperceptions, which, in our view, are the most serious barriers to transition. What can we do? Now, unfortunately, there's no magic wand to address this issue. However, the open solar contracts offer an alternative solution where the objectives of each player and management of their risks are taken into account. Under the open solar contracts, which we sometimes refer in this webinar as the OSC, the contractual arrangements are designed in an optimal manner to reach an overarching objective of shared value creation. Such shared value creation includes a common good objective, which is delivering sustainable, reliable, affordable, and modern energy for all. Simplifying the contractual process. The open solar contracts cover the key documentation on both the demand side and the supply side. They will help, firstly, governments to better structure their demand and obtain the best financial terms for the supply of power. And secondly, developers to structure key contractual relationships for equipment, service supply, debt financing, and to reduce, importantly, transaction costs and time. As the solar industry has developed, it has become clear that the solar industry is not comparable to large non-renewable projects, since they are by nature, i.e. solar projects, are relatively small and dispersed on the territory. But they are also mainly manufactured equipment, for example, inverters and panels manufactured in factories. The financial profile of a solar project is characterized by the fact that most expenditure is paid at the beginning of the project, that there is no fuel expenditure and limited O&M costs during the lifetime of the asset. Structuring and transaction costs stemming from the usual practices of non-renewable projects are incompatible with the economics of smaller sized solar projects with a cost structure that is mainly driven by initial investment. The replicability of the projects and the technology implemented make it possible to replicate contractual arrangements and make it possible to industrialize, and I emphasize industrialize, the transactional work and related costs by providing a universally acceptable contractual framework where negotiation is reduced to the essential technical and economic specifications on a project-specific and jurisdiction-specific basis. Addressing the main contractual issues. As mentioned on the previous slide, and we'll go into further detail on this slide, the open solar contracts anticipate a shift in the approach from a one-of-a-kind to a serial. Industrialization of the process means simultaneously being able to achieve higher scale and lower cost, economies of scale. Contractual standardization has proven its efficiency in growing markets and reducing transaction costs. For example, you have ISTA master agreement in the derivatives market, but also, as many of you will know, FIDIC in construction. The ambition of the open solar contracts templates is to enable industrialization of the contractual and transaction process. Having a solid set of templates enables the teams to focus on the specifics, which can be dealt with in the schedules to the templates and a key information table. The open solar contracts have primarily been designed to cut costs as much as possible, not only by providing simplified processes, but also by proposing new, substantial and innovative approaches. The contracts, and this is what I mentioned previously at the beginning of the webinar, this is an overarching theme of the open solar contracts and webinar, is that the contracts systematically allocate such risks in a way that they are handled by the party most capable to manage it. If this allocation is not systematically made, and we see many transactions where this allocation is not systematically made, this leads for the parties to whom the risks are pushed to having to invoice extra margins, which will affect significantly the levelized cost of energy, LCOE, because these margins are structurally transforming a risk into a certainty. Parties do not know if the risk will happen, but the cost, if it is already accounted into the price, whether it happens or not, and this cost is all the bigger that the party which invoices it is unable to manage it. In other words, a good deal is not the one which pushes the risks to the others. It is the one where the risks are pushed to the right entity under the right contract. And this is a real added value of the open solar contracts because it achieves just that. Meet the team. The contractual structure that connects contractually the government, the buyer, i.e. the off-taker, the project company, the investors, the contractors and the lenders are, as you can see from the slide, an implementation agreement between the government and the project company and its shareholder, a power purchase agreement between the project company and the buyer, a supply agreement between the project company and the supplier, an installation agreement between the project company and the installation contractor, an O&M agreement between the project company and the O&M contractor, and lastly, a financing term sheet between the project company and the lenders. Empowering the demand side. Now, the demand side contracts consist of a PPA and an implementation agreement. Liquidity agreements are referenced within the agreements, but do not form part of the suite. Let's start with the implementation agreement. As noted on slide 5, in order for all parties to effectively understand each other's and their own risks, clear expressions of the objectives is essential. This is especially true for governments, as their objectives are generally more complex than others, linked to public policies, hence political in essence. When governmental objectives are clear, policies can efficiently be implemented and enabling frameworks can be designed with the other participants in the structure to better deliver. The implementation agreement underpins the suite of contracts and can be understood as an expression of the government's objectives in a particular jurisdiction. The agreement sets out the terms of the concession by the government to the project company and replaces a requirement for a sovereign guarantee by setting out the buyout regime in the events of early termination. Certain project principles, for example, economic stabilisation, force majeure, dispute resolution, have been passed down from the implementation agreement to the other agreements in the suite. A partnership. As noted on slide 5, everything counts. In order to reduce the costs of solar projects, a symbiotic relationship is required between the public and private sectors in order to realise a cost-efficient IPP. Both the government, as shown vertically on the slide, and the private sector, shown horizontally on the slide, need to come together in partnership, with the government providing, in some cases, land, permitting, incentives, and the private sector, as you can see on the slide, deciding the technology and the finance. The impact of government policies and incentives, as may be legislated for in the implementation agreement, is therefore critical. The cost of capital has a considerable impact on LCOE, the levelised cost of energy. Regulatory, legal and financial risk reduction tools should be provided to enable investors and lenders to provide the necessary capital under the right conditions that will lead to competitive electricity prices. Investors and lenders need to understand and manage the risks both at a project level and a macro level. The open solar contracts have laid the groundwork by the same recurring theme, allocating and mitigating such risks across the suite of project contracts in the open solar contract suite. A smart way to regulate. At the heart of ambitious energy policies, governments must create an enabling environment to give both the direction and the framework, without which no large-scale electrification scheme can exist. In many cases, the absence or sufficiency of a legal framework adapted to renewable projects make it necessary to set up an implementation agreement between the power producer, the IPP, and the government. The implementation agreement can be viewed as an alternative approach, a panacea to the lengthy process of implementing legislative policy. The more the framework is implemented as law, the less comprehensive an implementation agreement will need to be, if not needed at all. The economic purpose of the implementation agreement can therefore be understood to establish the minimum legal framework necessary to carry out a particular project. As mentioned before, access to land, licenses, investment, incentives, financing, and so forth. This standardisation being necessary not only for the purposes of administrative efficiency, but also to streamline financing, reduce transaction costs, and risk premium. A mitigated overall liability. The put-call option regime embedded in the implementation agreement is the cornerstone of the open solar contracts, and ultimately, again, a recurring theme, allocates the key risks to the project, which in this sense is the right party, in a simple and fair manner. The government assumes political, force majeure and offtake risks by buying back the projects. The investors and the developer assume all technical risks but mitigate them via their contractors, i.e. by passing down the obligations and other force majeure risks. But this is a key point, but investors and developers are protected from political risks which have been allocated to the government. Lenders are always protected, enabling a substantial reduction of the cost of debt by virtue of the purchase price floor. Now, the purchase price floor is a mechanism whereby in all circumstances, lenders are paid 100% of the debt. Now, if you recall at the beginning of the webinar when we discussed everything counts, ensuring that lenders are protected could result in a significant reduction in the cost of financing, which we had noted can sometimes results in significant increases to the tariff. We do note that the put call option structure is not a complete solution to contingent liabilities, but a reasonable solution and importantly sits within the confines of bankability. The power purchase agreement. This is the second contract on the demand side. The parties to the PPA are of course the project company and the buyer. The purpose of the PPA is to legislate for the sale of energy produced by the facility and the terms upon which the buyer will purchase such energy from the project company. The substantive provisions of the PPA become effective when the conditions precedent set out in the implementation agreement have been satisfied. Again, this is an example of the strong interlinkages between the agreements and the importance of collective usage of the suite. A number of key provisions have been passed down from the implementation agreement to the PPA, for example, force majeure dispute resolution and so forth. Take or pay. This is a key slide. The Open Solar Contract PPA is a take or pay structure with deemed energy payments. In a take or pay PPA, the project company does not commit to selling a minimum amount of energy, and the buyer will purchase all energy that is generated by the facility. From a project company's perspective, take or pay would be required. The rationale for this is to remove the non-sale risk, which tends to be overpriced, and also to help the project company to secure project financing with more certainty on the cash flow. From a government's perspective, it is noted that governments prefer take and pay contracts so that off-takers only pay for energy actually taken. However, this would render such PPAs essentially merchant projects and would not be considered bankable in a project finance context. Whilst it is recognised that deemed energy payments and take or pay are not popular with off-takers, the Open Solar Contracts considers that take or pay and deemed energy payments are necessary to remove the non-sale risk, which is often overpriced, and to be able to achieve the best possible tariff. Transforming a risk into a certainty. I'm going to hand over to Jean-Pascal, who will talk us through the Excel.
Thank you, Hannah. Sorry, I have a feedback voice. You hear me?
We can, Jean-Pascal.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you, Hannah. I just wanted to walk you through the case study that we put together in order to show how counterintuitive the take-or-pay provision is, and how the take-or-pay provision, where the government and the off-takers commit to buy all the energy produced, is actually beneficial for them. Let's take the case of two projects, two exact same projects with a decent solar irradiation, or for instance 1750 kilowatt per kilowatt peak and a capacity of 200 megawatt. with a PR of 95% and a technical availability of 99%, which are the basic criteria of a solar installation. And on the basis of this kind of installation, and roughly without taking the degradation, the potential degradation, you get over 20 years of a potential power generation of 6.5 terawatt-hour over 20 years. And that is exactly the same starting point. But then you have the first effect of the choice and the option between take or pay and take and pay. In the take or pay, as the off-taker has committed to take all the energy produced, you don't consider any curtailment in the open solar contracts. There is sometimes a curtailment provision, but let's assume here we have not, and the loss anticipations, meaning that what the off-taker doesn't take, and which is obviously in a take or pay zero. To the contrary, in a take and pay, at the beginning and well before the operation has started, the project company and the developer will be obliged to try to anticipate what would the curtailment and the losses be. And for instance, in our case, they would assume that it amounts up to 7.5% for each of the total power generation over 20 years, meaning that actually the power to sell, the take and pay, will be 5.6 terawatt-hour over 20 years, which is almost 15% less than in the take or pay case. But that means that your basis of energy on which you are going to amortize your expenditures is smaller. And then on the expenditure side, assuming it's exactly the same project with the same capex, the same opex, you have already also a difference in the weighted average cost of capital, the WACC, because the lenders in particular will need to take a premium for the commercial risk should they accept to take this risk, which is generally not the case, as Hannah mentioned, in the project finance context. So basically, you have less energy to sell and bigger cost to amortize. In our case, by bigger cost by 7.6% more. So at the end of the day, just by making this calculation, you see that you have already a huge difference in the price per megawatt hour to be paid in the take or pay, which would be around 40, and in the take and pay, which would be around 50. So basically 25% more, just because you have changed the provision. But if you look at the real figures and you assume that, for instance, because over 20 years you can expect that your grid is going to work better, and you expect also probably that you're going to take more energy because you need this energy. Let's assume that you offtake 92% of the actual energy produced instead of 85. Then you will have bought 6 terawatt-hour, and at the end of the day, if you multiply what you actually paid, what you actually took by the price, which is taking into account what you would have not taken, then you end up with paying 300 million instead of 260. For less power. So basically you are paying 16% more in absolute terms for less energy. So basically opting or pushing for a take and pay is making sure that everything that the worst case that can happen is already paid for by you. So basically governments and off-takers are paying the risk they want to avoid beforehand, and this is precisely transforming a risk into a certainty, which is one of, if not the most important way of thinking of the open solar contracts, is really to avoid to prepay for a risk and to avoid it, to transform it into certainty. Over to you, Hannah. You're muted. Hannah, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal, for explaining in such an interesting way the rationale for why the open solar contracts PPA is a take or pay structure rather than a take and pay structure. Now let's move on to discuss liquidity support. Although the energy charge is contractually agreed under the PPA, there is still the risk that the buyer does not meet its payment obligations to the project company. This, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is known as liquidity or payment risk. Non-payment by the buyer will impact the ability of the project to fulfill its scheduled payment obligations, for example, debt service. This risk is considered material where the off-taker does not have a track payment history and or is considered uncreditworthy. And if you recall at the beginning of the webinar, we discussed the importance of acquiring data and develop science so that misperceptions of risks can be identified. Liquidity support can typically take the form of a letter of credit from a bank with replenishment obligations or an escrow account with replenishment obligations. As an escrow account, DSRA requires the deposit of cash into an account, making certain something that is not certain for an event that may or may not occur. Taking a risk and making this a certainty is then priced into the transaction. As Jean-Pascal mentioned, similar to the take or pay, the open solar contract attempts to avoid transforming risks into a certainty, whereas an LC is considered to be a cheaper option. I would note, for good order, that under the open solar contracts, the liquidity support instrument amount and specific elements are to be determined on a project-specific basis and set out in the key information table. At this juncture, it's probably helpful to set out and explain to you all what the key information table is. So you have within, and we'll show you in further detail at the later stage of the webinar, you have the contract template, which is expected to be acceptable in all jurisdictions. And then you have a key information table at the front of the contract, which is the place for the project specific and jurisdiction specific information to be included. You also then have schedules where the project specific and jurisdiction specific elements can be included. Well, we've now covered the demand side, and now we're moving to industrializing technology on the field and discussing the supply side contracts. Now, the supply side contracts comprise of the supply, installation and O&M agreement, as well as the financing term sheet. Governments may decide to impose these contracts in a government tender so that a clear and comprehensive package will then allow, again, this overarching theme, risk to be appropriately allocated to the right party and agreed at the outset. Split EPC. The open solar contracts provides for a separate supply and installation arrangement, rather than a single turnkey arrangement. The primary reason for proposing the split contracting structure is to avoid margin piling and further the objective of decreasing procurement costs. One of the major savings lies in the split of the traditional EPC contract into two separate contracts, a supply contract for the design and supply of the complete PV system, and an installation contract relating to the installation of the PV system, commissioning and of course balance of plant. The supply agreement. The main purpose of the supply agreement is to set out the details of the engineering, design, procurement, supply and delivery of the PV system. The parties to the supply agreement are the supplier and the project company. The agreement defines and guarantees a minimum installed capacity and a minimum performance ratio, which are the key drivers of this contract. As discussed previously on another slide, the main body of the supply agreement, as with the other contracts in the suite, set out general conditions that are expected to be acceptable in all jurisdictions where projects are to be undertaken. Again, this applies to all contracts within the suite. A key information table, user notes, and various schedules are provided where jurisdiction and project-specific details are to be considered and included. Highly manufactured equipment. Solar, compared to other technology, is a relatively simple technology, i.e. the equipment, panels, inverters, as mentioned previously, are produced in factories and thereafter installed on site. The modular and easy to install nature of solar PV reduces the need for a full scope EPC contract with an interface agreement, and hence it is possible to effect a split contract structure and achieve lower capital costs. Including the guaranteed PR in the supply contract and incorporating appropriate warranties in the installation contract ensures, recurring theme, the right obligations have been allocated to the right party. The right obligations in the right contracts equals the right price. This is the real added value of the open solar contracts. The installation agreement. The main purpose of the installation agreement is to set out the details of the installation of the PV system, provision of the balance of plant, and commissioning the facility. The parties to the installation agreement are the installation contractor and the project company. In addition to setting out the obligations of the installation contractor and the project company, the installation agreement includes a clear delineation of the responsibilities of the project company, the supplier, and the installation contractor. Keep it simple. As noted above, the installation contract legislates for a relatively simple task. The open solar contracts unpacks the mythology, and there really is a mythology that has developed that requires an expensive, wrapped, single point of liability structure. The split EPC equals optimal pricing. Ultimately, the delineation and scope of each party is clearly structured and drafted. I emphasize, clearly structured and drafted. The interface element, which is priced, may be considered an expensive addition to the structure. The O&M agreement. The O&M agreement is entered into between the project company as owner of the project and the contractor that will be responsible for the O&M of the facility, the operation and maintenance of the facility. The O&M agreement commences once the commercial operation date has been achieved under the installation agreement, strong interlinkages between the contracts. The O&M agreement has been drafted so that it is standalone and works in the same way regardless of whether the supplier or the installation contractor and the O&M contractor are the same corporate entity, and also notwithstanding whether the O&M agreement is running concurrently with the defect warranty period under the supply agreement or installation agreement. PR or not PR? That is the question. The key driver of the O&M agreement is the technical availability of the facility. The O&M contractor guarantees that the measured availability during each availability test period will meet or exceed the minimum guaranteed availability. Under the open solar contracts, the O&M contractor is only liable for the technical availability and not for the performance ratio, which is intrinsically linked to the equipment supplied, to the exception of module cleaning, of course. The system's performance is a fundamental technical characteristic of the system, which depends on the equipment that makes it up and not the way it is used, unlike conventional production assets where operation is decisive for system performance. While the O&M contractor is not required to provide a performance ratio guarantee, a responsibility falling on the supplier under the supply agreement, the right obligations sitting in the right contracts and allocated to the correct parties, the O&M contractor should be required to monitor and report on the performance ratio being achieved by the facility. It has been suggested that this should be included as a monitoring service. Of course, if parties insist, if the employer principal insists on including PR in an O&M contract, this can result in a price increase. Not reinventing the wheel. The financing term sheet. As the financing industry is fairly standardized, for example, via the LMA, the Open Solar Contracts has not sought to reinvent the wheel. Therefore, unlike the other 5 contracts, the finance term sheet is a comprehensive term sheet, and I emphasize comprehensive, rather than a full form contract. Financing is of course central because it connects the local project to the global financial market directly. The financing term sheet supports an emerging trend where the commercial banks show growing interest in standardizing their project financing. Importantly, the financing term sheet has been drafted in consistency with a contractual scheme developed in the Open Solar Contracts. No EPR, no sanctions. The Open Solar Contract does not contain EPR provisions and it does not contain sanction provisions, and we will explain the rationale for this and how this is mitigated. In relation to sanctions, the Open Solar Initiative initially intended to implement sanction language into the entire documentation. However, in a complex geopolitical context, it is most difficult for governments to accept such language and have potentially all of their solar power development policy at the mercy of foreign decisions. The sanction language has consequently been removed from the implementation agreement and the power purchase agreement. Now, in relation to EPR. In public-private partnerships, the contracts between the project company and its contractors commonly include equivalent project relief, EPR clauses. The purpose of an EPR clause is to limit the exposure of the project company to the contractor's claim regarding what the project company could itself claim and obtain from the buyer and/or the government. The outcome of EPR clauses is to avoid or at least limit the cash risk to the project company. Contractors commonly price this risk by increasing the price under the contracts, which have a corresponding impact on the energy charge under the PPA and the government's termination liability. After extensive discussions and consultations, the Open Solar Contract Initiative concluded that including an EPR clause would be economically detrimental overall. The margins that such a clause would imply would affect the levelized cost of energy to an extent that is not consistent with the risks, particularly, and I emphasize, particularly given that these risks can be mitigated. Let's evaluate. The risk of cost overruns is limited in a solar project, and the risk of not having an EPR clause is managed through, firstly, a lump sum price in the supply agreement, no cost overruns possible for the supply of the PV system, which is by far the largest share of the capex. A lump sum price in the installation agreement with very limited cost overrun potential in the agreement. Potential extra capital expenditure resulting from a change in law being covered by appropriate mechanisms and economic stabilisation provisions. Applicable provisions of the EPC O&M agreements that could give rise to EPR claims, for example, economic stabilisation, force majeure, dispute resolution, are back-to-back with the government agreements. This again highlights the importance of using the suite as a whole during given the strong interlinkages. Demo. It is important to emphasise that the contract should ideally be used together as a legal package rather than, as previously mentioned, piecemeal templates due to the strong interlinkages amongst the suite. If the contracts are used separately, there may be risks, issues that are not properly addressed. Follow the link. As you can see on the slide, there is the link to the Open Solar contracts. After the webinar, please do go and have a look at the website, download the templates, and you'll see just how easily accessible these are. Indeed, the Open Solar contracts are structured so as to require minimal amendments to the drafting when using the Open Solar contracts for a particular project in a particular jurisdiction. When you download the contracts, you will see that each Open Solar contract comprises of general terms and conditions in the main body of the agreement, which it is anticipated will be acceptable in all jurisdictions where projects are to be undertaken. A key information table and a number of schedules to the agreement where project-specific and jurisdiction-specific details may be included. As well as you'll see when you download the templates, a number of user footnotes highlighting instances where particular consideration needs to be given to particular clauses to ensure that such clauses are suitable for the particular project circumstance and jurisdiction. By starting with a set of documents, not only does it assist in maintaining document consistency in the industry, it also decreases the number of issues to be negotiated, thereby lowering the overall cost and time of projects. The Open Solar contracts provide innovative solutions, and I emphasize innovative solutions in a number of respects. For example, splitting the EPC contracting structure, whereas in the project finance market, you would ordinarily see wrapped contracting structure with an interface agreement for various reasons. The rationale for this approach is that this eliminates the risk premium margin piling, thereby decreasing procurement costs. Another example in the way in which the Open Solar contracts are innovative is that a number of ordinarily heavily negotiated provisions, which are generally inconsistent in various project documents, have now been made either to be consistent throughout all the Open Solar contracts and are back-to-back. This is important because not only is it likely to save time and effort, it should also boost efficiency and innovation, as the only issues that contracting parties have to focus on are the actual project-specific issues, resulting in an increased rate of completion of projects, whether large-scale or small-scale. Takeaways. Our takeaway is less talk, as it shows on the slide, less talk, more interconnection. The Open Solar contracts are standardized and simplified templates that can be tailored with minimal amendments. The Open Solar contracts are a balanced risk allocation between the government and private sector. And as emphasized throughout this webinar, the right obligations, the right risks have been allocated to the right parties under the right contracts, which reduces costs overall. The Open Solar contracts are innovative, a new approach to existing practices. The Open Solar contracts are bankable, And the Open Solar contract templates can be downloaded, edited in Word format, and amended at no cost and with no strings attached. Thank you very much. Over to you, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I think we can all agree that that has been a fantastic and fascinating insight into the operation of the open solar contracts, how these can be deployed to scale up solar, but also to understand the thinking and the effort, the tremendous effort, I should note, that has gone into the development of these contracts. When you sit here and when you listen to Hannah, to Jean-Pascal, you really do realise the depth of effort and the depth of thinking that has gone into creating a holistic and comprehensive package. And it's really fantastic. It's absolutely tremendous that these are available for the benefit of all and for use by all. I wanted to first thank Hannah and Jean-Pascal for today's presentation. I'm sure you've all enjoyed it as much as I have, and will have taken away a lot about how these contracts can be deployed. These innovative financing mechanisms can be used to support the deployment of solar. I've included the link in the Q&A, and we do have some questions already, which, if Jean-Pascal and Hannah would be so inclined, may I suggest would you be willing to start answering? Fantastic.
You hear me?
We do now.
Okay, sorry for that. So there are several questions, and some are very specific, but let's start, for instance, by the one about the risk allocation and the scope of work in the engineering and design. That's an excellent question. Again, what we considered is that the equipment itself, the PV system, is mainly an industrial product, but it's not directly out of the manufacturer. And the question is right. There is a part of engineering and design which is necessary to choose and to pick and choose the right equipment and to size it properly so that the equipment is delivering with the right quality, the performance rate, and the right guarantees the performance ratio and the capacity. So basically, this lies on the supplier in the supply contract, on the supplier. The supplier is supposed, based on the information either provided by the product company or that it get from the developers to design the product. Hence to a certain extent, it's an engineering and supply contract, and and this is also why the reason why the supplier is responsible for the capacity and performance. The installation contractor is not responsible for the engineering, except for the balance of plant, which generally is very limited. Hannah, do you have something else to add on this question?
Answered it very comprehensively. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question is that why can't the solar contracts be transparent and competitive? Well, it has disappeared. and actually it is transparent and competitive, and it is available for free for everyone, and it is precisely designed to help every stakeholder, in particular to help governments and off-takers to scale up, to implement their policies and scale up their solar power procurement in very good terms. It's really meant also, as Hannah mentioned, to create shared value, meaning that everyone needs to get something in the transactions, and it's a complex transaction. If not, we might face the situation that the people don't have interest in particular in maintaining the operations over the long term, and hence so some issues that the market has known already. The interest of this open solar contracts is not only a balanced risk allocation, but a balanced risk value creation across the various stakeholders. Question about. Sorry, go for it.
No, I see a question that's come in from Sakir. Hello, Sakir. We would say that the open solar contracts are more geared, or have had the emerging markets as the target, but certainly the open solar contracts, they can be used across the globe, and are intended to be universally acceptable by virtue of the substantive provisions in the contracts, which can then be tailored via the key information table, user notes and schedules. Jean-Pascal, anything to add?
No. I think you're right. It has primarily been designed to be easy to use and to limit the need for capacity building also, which is one of the problems. But in general, we need to also acknowledge that whether developing countries or developed countries, we are all in transitions, and we are all discovering new worlds that actually we don't really know. So it's important. We took that into account and designed something which potentially can be universal. After that, it's true also that in developed countries, the governments have taken, for many reasons, very various and very different steps in terms of regulations, and sometimes they don't fit into the system. For instance, in France and in Europe in general, there are contracts for difference which are not PPAs, but contract for difference, which is another way to provide support to renewable energy. I think we are not there yet in most of the countries, because you don't have a reliable market on which you can base the difference. But you can also see that once the contract for difference that the governments are providing are going to go away because the solar is more and more competitive, then the market will shift more and more to what we call corporate PPAs, which basically are PPAs without a public off-taker. But it's mostly the same structure again, maybe a shorter tenure. A good question about the Paris climate change guidelines in considerations. Actually, the contract themselves are designed to avoid all unnecessary costs, and to accelerate the transition to or the development and deployment of solar power because it is more affordable to a broader range of people, which is a really important condition. So they are designed actually to achieve, from an economic point of view, the purpose of the Paris Agreement, but they ask, as per per themselves, contracts are not emitting anything. They are just helping non-emitting power generation to scale up faster. Well, Hannah, do you want to?
I would just add that bankability is in our view a constantly evolving process, and the open solar contracts are part of that evolution, and that evolution, whilst may have a focus in emerging markets, is something that can be considered universally as well.
So about the microgrids, what role microgrids will play in future solar generation? I'm not sure that is directly linked to the open solar contracts, but this is a very good question, because the open solar contracts are basically designed initially for grid connected power generation, but to a certain extent it can form also the basis for a microgrid system. It needs to be reparametered and take into account who will be the off-taker. But if you have a single off-taker in a microgrid system, which in turn will be in charge of distribution of power in the microgrid, then you can have something on the basis of which you can rely to start up adapting this set of contracts to microgrids. But I also know that IRENA is contemplating this idea to develop the microgrid open contract, and if they do, which I hope very much, because it's a really important way to develop access to energy at sufficient scale. It will be absolutely useful to have standardized contracts as well in this field. What else? Other question about the EPC, the installation agreement. Is this an EPC contract? And if so, why would the developer choose this over FIDIC? I think that the installation agreement is basically an installation agreement. It's not an EPC. It's just installing. It's just installing the power, the PV system, and complying with the mounting instructions, which should not be much more complicated than an IKEA mounting instructions, and maybe exaggerating a little bit. So it's not comparable to a FIDIC EPC for sure. It's just installing, and the responsibility of the installation contractor is just to follow in detail and precisely the mounting instructions.
I would also just add, to augment what you've said, Jean-Pascal, which I agree with, is that FIDIC in a project finance context needs to be quite heavily amended in order for it to be considered bankable in a project finance context. And what the installation agreement and the supply agreement provides within the suite of open solar contracts is that these contracts are considered bankable from the word go, as opposed to, say, FIDIC, which would need to be amended for it to be considered project finance bankable.
I think also that well, the allocation and the delineation of responsibilities and liabilities between in the split EPC, which I understand is something a little bit new, is pretty straightforward when you read at the contracts themselves. And I invite you to take a look in more detail to that. And when you read it side by side, and they have been developed side by side, you understand very well who does what. And again, maybe the image of the IKEA furniture is a little bit simplistic, but basically it is what it is. Basically, a solar park or solar installation is something which is made in a factory. You put that in a box and you ship it somewhere, and you ask someone else to install it, applying the mounting instructions. And then you can see that the installation contractor cannot and is not liable for the product that he has just received and is committed to mount. But if he's late, or if it damages the equipment while mounting it, is liable for that. And if you limit its liability to what exactly it does, so you limit the price that is supposed to bill to the project company. Hence, you have a very important effect on the pricing of the electricity, and that's something. I used to be a developer, a solar developer, and that's the structure that we put in place. It is perfectly bankable. It works perfectly well, and it is really efficient in terms of cost reduction.
If there were no more questions that we would answer today, we might wrap it up there at this point in time, Hannah and Jean-Pascal. Apologies to all those whose questions we didn't get to, but thank you all so much again for attending. It's been wonderful to have you here. And this recording will be available on the ISA Infopedia website. Thank you again to Hannah and Jean-Pascal for a fantastic presentation, and also their very generous time, both in presenting but in responding to people's questions, to the audience's questions, and to be able to really draw out some of these intricacies and these and the details surrounding the open solar contracts. Again, I'd just like to highlight that this webinar will be running on Monday as well, in French, for those Francophone members of our community. And we hope that you might be able to either join us, or that you might be able to let your colleagues, friends, network, etc. know that this will be running on Monday. So thank you both once again, and to all those in our audience, please have a good morning, a good afternoon, a good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and please stay safe and take care in this COVID world. Thank you.
Thank you.